I've met a lot of very unusual characters and dealt with them during the course of all these years. And I learned something from each of those experiences that helped me overcome challenges. We all have challenges, and I felt that reading the anecdotes and then reflecting on the challenges they represented might help people overcome their own challenges, whatever stage of life they're at.
Hello and welcome to today's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Dan Ashley, news anchor at ABC 7 in San Francisco and a member of the Commonwealth Club World Affairs Board of Governors, and proud to be your moderator for today. Our thanks to Toby Philanthropies for their continued support of the American Values Series. Well, now it is my great pleasure to introduce Wilbur Ross, former U.S. Secretary of Commerce and author of Risks and Returns: Creating Success in Business and in Life. Over his 55-year career, Wilbur has restructured more than $400 billion in assets. He founded his own private equity firm and purchased and restored many companies to profitability, including those in the steel, apparel, and banking industries. He served as our 39th Secretary of Commerce secretary, where he advised President Donald Trump on commercial and economic affairs and helped American entrepreneurs and businesses create jobs and economic opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome former U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross. Mr. Ross, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
We have I have a million questions to ask because I really enjoyed this book a great deal. But I'm going to start with the elephant in the room, if I may, and then we'll move on. You worked for President Donald Trump. Would you work for him again?
That's a good question. I think the first trick would be, will he be elected again? That's the bigger hurdle than anything. But I think in general, it's a little early to divide up the spoils.
Well, are you a supporter of his? Really?
Oh, yes.
You are?
Yes.
Okay.
Sure.
Let me ask you about this book at this time in your life. And I should point out, when we met today, he told me some really great news for him and for the book. It is number 12 this week on Amazon in all books. So he's beating a lot of cookbooks and other everything out there, autobiographies. So that obviously this book is being well received. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
At this point in your life, Mr. Secretary, why did you write this book?
Well, I'm sort of a late bloomer. I became an entrepreneur at age 63, when most people getting ready to retire. And then when I was appointed to the cabinet, I was the oldest person ever appointed to a U.S. cabinet.
Is that right?
So now, at 86, going on 87, I'm trying a book. So that's 3 late blooming activities.
But you know, it is a great point that in life it's never too late to do anything, is it?
Right.
Right? Try whatever you wish and don't let wherever you are in your life slow you down. What is it, the message that you want? This book is very accessible, actually. It can be intimidating when we're talking about the high finance that you've been involved in that most people don't understand. But this book really isn't that. This is something that lay people can understand and digest. What was your mission in writing this book for them?
Well, the mission in writing it is I've met a lot of very unusual characters and dealt with them during the course of all these years. And I learned something from each of those experiences that helped me overcome challenges. We all have challenges, and I felt that reading the anecdotes and then reflecting on the challenges they represented might help people overcome their own challenges, whatever stage of life they're at. But I'm especially targeting it for young people. And the young people, to my great pleasure, Yale School of Management has taken 500 books for their whole student body. Harvard has an undergraduate course, in entrepreneurship, and they took $250 for that. So I'm very pleased that an audience of young people going into business is going to have some very direct exposure. But it's not a textbook, and it's, I think, a pretty easy to read book, and I think you did.
Yeah, it is a easy to read book, actually easier than I thought it might have been given the subject matter or the perception of the subject matter starting it. That's great news about these two venerable
Right.
universities
Right.
taking this book. What do you tell young people about beginning their careers, whether it's in business or anything else? What advice do you give young people today?
Well, several things. I think, unfortunately, the younger generation is a little bit fragile in terms of some of the personality traits, and they're easily backed off. And I think they should do much better if they would overcome those tendencies. The safe room is a nice idea, but it's not really the way to get ahead in life or in commerce. So I think they need to resuscitate the American dream, which was work hard, take advantage of opportunities, and prosper. I think that's what the country needs. I think that's what most people need. And the challenges that come very often have opportunities inside them.
You've often heard we learn more from failure and adversity than you do from success.
Right.
When you say resuscitate the American dream, that's a really powerful and fascinating statement. What is it that has decreased the American dream, hurt the American dream, hurt Americans' ability to pursue that dream in your
Well,
to the point it needs resuscitation?
I think people need to have self-pride, and they need to be willing to go a little extra mile. What troubles me are things like there's a Reddit site that has 6 million participants devoted to anti-work. And some of the posts on it are things like, I just can't force myself to go to work anymore. Well, the notion that work is aberrant behavior, is weird, has to be force-fed, that's antithetical to the American dream. I worked my way through college and through Harvard Business School, so I know a little bit about working. And in fact, in an amusing thing, since eventually the census was part of commerce, I was a census taker as one of my part-time jobs. And they gave me a very tough district in Boston to go to. Well, in this district, you show up with a white school patrol belt and a big badge. You're lucky they don't put the dogs on you. So I learned a little bit about rejection on a one-to-one level.
You know, you were born in 1937, is that right?
Yes.
So by the time you were a young boy, 7, 8, 9 years old, World War II had come to an end. Do you have any, and then of course, rebuilding this country, which is so prosperous after World War II. Do you remember those years? Were you young and old enough to remember what it was like coming out of World War II?
Yes. My most memorable memory of it was one that I think was in the book. Namely, we used to have air raid drills in the public school that I was at. And generally in the drill, they would march us all down to the basement and have us sit against the wall. So one day, one of the teachers asked the group, what do you think about sitting against the wall? Why do you think we ask you to do that? And the thought that popped into my head, which turned out the teacher did not like as an answer, I said, well, maybe to make it easier to count the bodies.
Oh.
And I wasn't trying to be a wise guy. It was just that was what popped into my head. So I remember the war. I remember rationing. My father was an air raid warden in our little neighborhood. He wore a little tin hat, and he would go around at night making people turn off their lights because the idea was if bombers came over, lights would help them find targets. So it was a little weird. The other thing about it, it was my first exposure to China in a very strange way. My mother would stand in line to get bananas. Bananas were apparently in very short supply, and I didn't like bananas. So to try to get me to eat the bananas, she said, well, think about the poor, starving children in China. You should really eat your bananas. And to this day, it's not clear to me how my eating bananas would help the poor children in China.
But those were formative years and very powerful memories, because it was clear, I guess, even to you at a young age, that there was some hardship and there was a national emergency and effort being made. How did that shape you?
Well, there was that, but I also had some personal hardships in that I've always been a bookworm, been a scrawny kid, and so I was an ideal target for bullying. Uh-huh. And after that began for a while, my dad got me a punching bag and a few lessons, and while I didn't have to use it that much, the fact of feeling you could take care of yourself gave one confidence and made you a little less as a target for the bullies. And it's a lesson that I haven't forgotten. And I think it's something that's applicable today to geopolitics. And I'll tell you a story about Trump that kind of illustrates that.
Please.
The first state visit that we took in the administration was President Xi from China. And it was meant to begin with a big, elaborate ceremonial dinner at Mar-a-Lago, the old Meriwether Post estate. So that was scheduled for 6:30, but at 2 in the afternoon, I got a call from one of his aides saying, we're going to have an emergency National Security Council meeting. I was a member of the National Security Council. We're in an emergency Security Council meeting, so you have to come to the safe room. There's a very insulated room with no windows or anything. And in the book, you'll see a photograph of us all crowded into this little room. President Trump, Secretary Mnuchin, myself, a whole bunch of people, a lot of generals. And that was the meeting at which we decided to launch 52 missiles into Syria in retaliation for their attack on one of our air bases in the Mideast. And Trump made a strategic decision when to announce it. He decided to announce it smack in the middle of dinner with President Xi at 7:15 that evening. That was a good time to hit the Mideast because there's around a 7-hour time difference. But I think it was because he wanted to send a message, not just to Iran, but to Xi, push me too far and you're going to get a response that you don't like. So it was sort of an anti-bully thing. But the actual circumstance of him making the announcement to Xi was quite interesting. Xi had been dominating the whole conversation in dinner, speaking through his interpreter, and his topic was the history of China, at least his version of it. And he had just gotten through the colonial oppression and was about to talk about the Japanese invasion when an aide came up, a little white note, gave it to Trump. Trump looked at it, put it in his pocket, and said, President Xi, I don't mean to interrupt the discussion, but we just did something very important, and I want you to hear it from me, not just learn it through your intelligence people. And he said, we launched the 52 missiles. Xi, who had been speaking through an interpreter the whole evening, said in perfect English, repeat, please. And that told us a couple of things that we didn't know before. The interpreter did repeat it to him in Chinese. He responded through the interpreter. And what he said was, gee, Mr. President, you've surely had a busy afternoon, haven't you? He never again mentioned it. very cool cucumber.
Interesting.
Doesn't blink. So it was a lesson to us what we were about to face as we went through dealings with Prison G.
There are a lot of questions I want to ask you about China as we go forward here, and we'll get to that. You know, it just occurred to me as you're speaking, all these amazing experiences you had. A kid from New Jersey. What did your father do for a living?
Well, he was part of a little two-man law firm, and my mom, well, he was alive, and my mom was a third-grade teacher.
So you're a middle-class kid, upper-middle-class kid? A middle-class kid, upper-middle-class kid?
Barely.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, it occurs to me as you were telling that story, was it ever strange to you, from whence you came, here you are in these meetings and these environments with fellow world leaders, and you as a cabinet secretary, pretty heady stuff.
Yes, it was. The pomp and ceremony of being in a high government position are highly infectious and hard to get out of your system.
How old, when did your father pass away? How old were you?
I was an early teenager.
Oh, so he passed away young. He never saw your success.
Oh, no. Never saw me graduate from college.
Has that left a mark on you? I mean, you had such a Hall of Fame career, a remarkable career.
Well, it left a mark, but what happened, I had two younger siblings, and since the main income now was my mother as a school teacher, and we didn't have a lot of capital, so I put myself through school the rest of the time to leave some money for my younger brother and my younger sister to also get an education. But at the time, it didn't seem so strange. I knew a lot of fellow students who were in somewhat the same circumstances, and it was just what you had to do.
Right. Let's fast forward now into your business career after finishing Harvard. How did you find this career? I knew you became an entrepreneur later in life, but what drew you to the world of finance?
Well, my first experience working was actually before I went to college. I was a car parker at Monmouth Park Jockey Club in Oceanport, New Jersey. And the first day we were there, the kids were assembled by Louis the Lot Boss, and Louis the Lot Boss explained to us the rules of the track. And the rule was this: there will be accidents as you're parking and unparking the cars, but if the customer notices that the headlights are bashed or something and reports it before leaving the track will pay for the damage, and you'll get set down from work for a week. And if it happens twice, you'll be fired.
Oh.
But he said, there's a solution to it. If you distract the customer, they won't notice it until they leave the premises, and then you'll be okay. And so here he was explaining to us. He said, if it's a convertible, put the top up as you're coming, and the driver will say, what the hell are you doing putting the top up while you're coming? And he won't notice whatever was the damage. Or if it wasn't a convertible, turn the radio on real loud and put the windshield wipers on. And he'll say, it's a sunny day, what the hell you got the windshield wipers on? So it was my first experience where an employer was dictating how we should fleece his customers. It was a very bizarre concept of business. So I'm at Yale, and the advisor to the fraternity I was part of called me on April 1st, just before spring vacation, or just after spring vacation, before the summer. And he said, Wilbur, what are you going to do this summer? And I said, well, imagine I'll be car parking again like I did last year. And he said, no, I'm leaving the universities. He was one of the portfolio managers for Yale, which had a big reputation.
Sure.
And he said, I'm leaving to go to an investment boutique, and you're going to come along and be my clerk. So since it was April 1st, I waited a few minutes and called him back. to make sure it wasn't just a prank. And it was not. So he had me start. And once I was there, I knew that was what I wanted to do, because my earlier dream had been to be a writer. And in Yale, in the sophomore year, they have a course called Daily Themes. Every day you have to put in a little mail slot 1,000 words of fiction. Well, by the end of the second week, I was out of material. So I dropped the course, dropped the idea of being a writer, and as a result, Yale saved me from a life of poverty.
Well, the good news about that, my first job, I worked at Swenson's Ice Cream and made sundaes.
Sure.
The good news, you know, if we need to, I can go back to making ice cream. You can go back to parking cars, if it comes to that. So you embarked really good fortune into this
Yes.
career.
Yes.
And knew instantly it was for you.
Yes.
Was it the action? Was it the intellectual challenge of it? Was it the horse trading and the negotiation and the business dealings of it? What was it that attracted you to this?
Well, I've always been very good at numbers, and obviously Wall Street, in a sense, is a mechanism for taking emotions and translating them into numbers, and then taking numbers and translating them into emotions. So that was my layman's concept of what Wall Street was all about. So I liked that, and I liked the challenge, the intellectual challenge. This particular firm, their shopping list each day was the new low column. They didn't believe in buying stocks that were way up. They would go through what were the ones that hit a new low that day on the theory that if they could analyze and find that it was overdone, maybe that would be a low-risk thing because it had been beaten down, and maybe have a big opportunity. So that was what was my first hint about distress and distressed securities. But I got a better lesson between Yale and Harvard Business School in that I became a summer trainee at the old J.P. Morgan. And that was my first exposure to a really high-powered corporate culture. The bankers at Morgan felt, and probably weren't far off, that they were the best bankers in the world, and they instilled that kind of team spirit in all the people. They were then about to go through a merger with a much bigger bank, Guaranty Trust, that didn't have the panache that Morgan had, but had a big balance sheet. So for weeks before the merger, they were drilling us. We can't lose our corporate culture. And the symbol of their corporate culture was every officer had a mahogany roll-top desk next to which was a polished brass spittoon. Very few people smoke cigars and use a spittoon in those days, but it was the symbol.
Right.
So they do the merger with Guaranty. I was the first trainee sent over to the Guaranty Trust Department. And going up with me in the elevator was a Morgan secretary. And in those days, the Morgan secretaries all wore cashmere sweaters, came from the Seven Sister Schools, had a little string of pearls, and carried a Wall Street Journal under their arm. So not your typical secretary. So as this girl was going up in the elevator with me, a Guaranty counterpart said, "Well, tell me, dearie, how do you think you'll like it here at 140 Broadway?" And the Morgan girl said, "Well, how would you feel if you were working at Tiffany's and you were transferred to Woolworths?" Silence in the elevator.
Good answer.
So the corporate culture had penetrated to the secretarial level.
That's a good story. There's a good answer. Well, on the subject, what you ended up doing and with Merrill and with your own firm is negotiation. And you talk a lot about negotiation in this book, and it doesn't matter, it's economy of scale, whether you're negotiating something small or something enormous like billion-dollar acquisitions. What lessons did you learn and do you pass along about negotiation?
Right.
You don't do it, you prepare for that. You don't just show up.
Well, yeah, I feel a good way to negotiate is to view it as two people each trying to convince themselves to do what the other one doesn't really intend to do. So I think the attitude should be a friendly one, should be one of a sales kind of personality, and should start with the easy points where you can reach agreement, build a little bit of momentum until you get to the harder ones. Now, sometimes it doesn't work because the other guy is quite aggressive, and that's how I met Trump. I made a big specialty out of doing bankruptcies, but never representing the company. I was always representing the victims, the bondholders
I see.
or the stockholders. And in this case, Trump Taj Mahal got Merrill Lynch and Bear Stearns to underwrite $800 million of mortgage bonds to finance the startup of the casino. The only problem was the bonds never made one interest payment. So the bondholders were naturally a little bit cross about that. And they hired me on the Thursday before Labor Day weekend to help them get their money back. So as soon as Trump heard that over the newswire, he called and he said, "You have to come down to Atlantic City tomorrow." Well, the last damn place I wanted to be was in Atlantic City with a bunch of people playing slot machines for Labor Day weekend. I wanted to be in Southampton. But I felt I had to do it. So I went out to the heliport, and there was his chopper. You couldn't miss it because in bright nail polish red letters, TRUMP on the side of the machine. So we go to Atlantic City, about a 40-minute flight. We land on the boardwalk 200 feet from the casino, and Trump was there in a big stretch limo waiting. And I noticed something. I noticed on the front bumper there were two flags. One was a U.S. flag, and the other was a Trump flag. And the Trump flag was a little bit bigger than the U.S. flag. So it was a demonstration of his penchant for understatement. So it's mobbed with people, and they're really excited to see him in person. They didn't care about me. They didn't even know me. So we get inside the casino, and people are having him sign their beanie cap, sign their notepad. One lady was in a bareback dress. She had him sign her back. So she had black magic marker pen, Donald J. Trump. Well, I don't know what she was going to do with that, but that's what she did. So then we started what he called discussions, and he began in a very low-key way, reminding me the bonds were trading at 20 cents on the dollar. And he said, "You'll be lucky if your clients get 20 cents at the end of this process. But I'll tell you what, so let's settle it right now for 20 cents, and I'll personally guarantee it." I said, "Well, Donald, there's only one problem. My clients hired me to get them 100 cents plus the back interest, plus all the stock in the casino." So we sparred for a couple of hours. I got no place with him at all. So I finally said, "Well, is that it? That's where you are, at least for today? Just 20 cents? He said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, then I'm not going to waste my time here this weekend." And I walked out on him. He was quite shocked because that was the kind of approach that he would use in negotiation rather than it being used on him. Then he tells the story on himself, including to a large group at my 85th birthday. So it's not like he was embarrassed by it. No. The months go by and we had very public bickering. And meanwhile, he's gradually coming up. And finally, one day, early in October, I went over to his office in the morning, made what I described as our best and final offer. and he rejected it. So I said, well, then we're going to see you in court. And so I went back to my office. We put out a press release that said the Trump Taj Mahal bondholders going to have a very important press conference at 5 o'clock at the Marriott Marquis. We picked the Marriott Marquis because it wasn't one of his hotels. He had the plaza. So
Right on Times Square.
yeah, right across from his office at the southeast corner of Central Park and Fifth. He saw it over the news ticker, so he called me and said, what the hell is this? You're doing a press conference? What are you going to talk about? I said, well, Donald, I told you we'd see you in court. We're going to announce that we're putting an involuntary bankruptcy petition against the Taj Mahal, and you're going to be in bankruptcy tomorrow morning. So he said, well, let me consult with my advisors. He came back, we bickered a little bit, and we finally worked it out. So he then said, but one more thing. And I had spent enough time with him that I knew one more thing usually was a big hooker.
Right.
But in this case, he said, the one more thing, you have to move it to the Plaza Hotel from the Marriott Marquis. He couldn't bear having the press conference at someone else's hotel. Now,
Did you move it?
Yeah, we did. We moved it. Now, the moral of the story was Carl Icahn, meanwhile, had become the biggest bondholder after they crashed. And Carl and I have been friends for a long time and compatriots in a lot of battles. Both of us, after having fought with him for all these months, decided to be early endorsers of his 2016 candidacy, because when you're confronting people under those sorts of adversarial circumstances, you get to know what they're made of. And we concluded he was made of pretty good stuff underneath all the bravado and all the other trappings. So there was that bankruptcy indirectly led ultimately to my becoming cabinet secretary.
And even though your relationship was adversarial and it may have been cordial but adversarial,
Hugely adversarial.
he still hired you. He still wanted you. He still hired you years later.
Yes, he did. And after that press conference that I mentioned, I get in the car, and as you can appreciate, this is a very trying day going through it and then the conference. So I'm in the car, the phone rings. This is your mother, in just about those tones. And I said, well, hi, Mom, what's up? And she said, it's not good at all. I said, well, what are you talking about? And she said, well, I've been playing mahjong with my lady friends while we were watching that press conference, and we all concluded after the mean things he said in the press about you, you should never make a deal with him. And she went on to add, if you'd only become a lawyer like I always wanted you to, you wouldn't have to hang around with people like that. And then she hung up on me. She later forgave me, at least for the Trump part. She didn't forgive me for not being a lawyer.
Remarkable story. So just what did you learn about, you said you learned that he was made of different stuff than his public bravado and persona. What did you learn about the former president in that moment?
Quite a few things. Number one, he has pretty much a photographic memory, particularly of things that he dislikes. And part of what you see coming out in some of the rhetoric is things that he feels strongly about need change, need fixing. And so that was part of it. But the second thing was he always conducted himself honorably. He was fighting with us, and he was tough, but there was no sort of evil work, no funny business that he was trying to pull, whereas a lot of people who run a bankrupt company got all sorts of schemes to try to get around you. He wasn't that way at all. He was up front.
But that is not his the perception of the former president
Oh, I know,
in business and politics.
I know it's
at all.
not. But mostly people don't view me as such a pushover, and they certainly don't view Carl as a pushover. So all I can say is that. But I would also say there's a big difference between the substance of the man and the style. There are a lot of stylistic issues that everybody, including me, have with the way he comports himself. But what I think people should do in analyzing him is think about the substance. During his presidency, we had very low inflation, very low unemployment. We had fairly peace and quietude in the Mideast. North Korea was pretty quiet. Russia didn't invade anything. China wasn't too bad. And I attribute it a lot to some of the characteristics people don't like about him. One, they felt he was the leaders felt he was a little unpredictable, and having seen what he did with Syria, they were a little bit wary about playing too many games with him. The second thing was that they felt that a lot of the people around him were giving him pretty decent advice, that we understood the situation. And so there was a degree of respect. They didn't like the bluster. They didn't like the bravado at all. That's not what characterizes big diplomatic circles.
Okay. Very interesting. Thank you for that perspective. Let's turn now to some of the policy issues and
Sure.
some of the issues. You talked about some in the book. And again, the book is Risks and Returns, Creating Success in Business and Life, with former U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, our guest today. Let's talk about where the United States is in the world economically and the risks and opportunities. We have a huge trade imbalance in
Right.
some countries. We have a huge national deficit, which
Right.
$73 trillion or something, or 43 trillion maybe is a number. I'm doing it from my memory. But what are the risks and opportunities? Where are we on the world stage economically?
Well, in terms of the national debt, I think the only way we're ever going to get the debt under control is to have the economy grow at a much faster rate than it's been. I think unless it grows at 4 or 4+%, we will keep adding more debt, probably regardless of whether it's Trump or it's Kamala Harris, because right now the deficit, the budget deficit, is running about $1.9 trillion a year. It's well over 4% of the gross domestic product, the gross size of the economy. Well, if that is over 4% and your economy is only growing at 2%, you're going to have more debt every year.
Right.
So the only way out, realistically, is to grow more rapidly.
Can you save your way to prosperity in this instant? In other words, reduce expenses, or not really?
There's room to reduce some of it. Then there's also room to redirect some of it. What I mean by the redirection is the current policy emphasizes social welfare programs, beefing up unemployment, childcare, all these things that are very meritorious, but the problem with them is the money that goes into them gets spent right away. So it creates more demand for goods and services. It doesn't create any more supply. Well, if you have more demand and no more supply, you're going to get inflation, as sure as we're sitting here. So I think redirecting it to where we didn't emphasize as much paying people for not working as we did paying people while they worked. There are a number of people who in the post-COVID period literally were making more not working than they ever had made when they were working. That sets up a very bad mindset, and it, I think, contributes to the anti-work mentality that I mentioned before. We need it to go into productive use, and that will help the economy grow faster, so it'll help with the debt and it will help with inflation.
Is that deficit a real worry, something we must contend with, or can we keep kicking that can down the road for a while longer?
Well, countries never actually repay their debt. Name one that really has repaid it. They just roll it over. So the real issue is, will we always be able to roll it over? And as long as people believe in the government, are proud of their national interests, and as long as their borrowings aren't in foreign currencies, you can go for quite a ways. The reason I emphasize the currencies, when the less developed countries default, the reason generally is because of economic problems, their currency gets whacked, so the debt that they had incurred in dollars becomes even bigger in terms of their local currency. We're blessed in that essentially all of our debt is dollar denominated. So we aren't incurring a currency risk with our borrowing.
That's interesting. One of the issues in this campaign, this presidential cycle, is tariffs, and it was certainly something you talked about when you were in the administration, in the Trump administration, and these trade imbalances, and Donald Trump, again, is talking about tariffs. Talk about the role of tariffs in dealing with the trade imbalances in the world, particularly with China, but other countries as well.
First of all, I'm very pleased and grateful that my successor, Gina Raimondo, has very much continued our policies, both on tariffs and on export controls. We put export controls on a lot of technical products that are what we call dual use. They have a consumer use, but they also have a military use. So it's one of the few segments of policy that have been implemented in a similar fashion by the new administration. And I think there's a reason for it. The trade deficit is an enormous problem. Since the accession of China to the WTO, $10 trillion between trade deficit and foreign direct investment has gone into China. Think what a different US we would have and what a different Europe we would have if that money, or most of it, had stayed home. The real economic miracle in China came from the WTO and the resulting trade deficits that we had and foreign investment. Before WTO, China's economy was bumping along, not doing much of anything. WTO zoomed.
Interesting. Now, your contention would be, we're not trying to not compete. We're happy to compete. You just want an even playing field.
Yeah, it needs to be on a level playing field. It needs to be fair competition, and it isn't right now. I'll give an example. We put the tariffs on steel and on aluminum, on all that stuff that was imported and many other products. People were saying, oh my God, there's going to be inflation, the economy will be destroyed, we won't be able to afford to buy a car anymore because of the steel, on and on and on and on. But it never happened. And the reason it didn't happen is several things. These countries that subsidize their exports, and almost all of them do, and they almost all have big barriers to import. Well, all they do, if we put a 20% tariff, they'll increase somewhat their subsidy of the company. And the company maybe will absorb part of it. But the other thing that happens is, if we put 20%, it doesn't mean the price will go up 20%, because you'll go to the next least expensive source of supply, a substitute product. And that's why we never really had big inflation, despite all the tariffs.
So it's not a one-for-one thing.
It's by no means a one-for-one thing. And therefore, it's a misnomer to characterize it as a tax on everybody. It's just not how it works.
Where are the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, China, India, have really emerged as much bigger economies, competing on the world stage in a much different way. Are we still in a position of power and prominence, or have we lost a lot of ground?
Well, we've lost.
And why does it matter?
Yeah, we've lost quite a bit, and I think it's mostly because the diplomatic policy of late has been to underreact to bad things that the other countries are doing. Think about it. We didn't really react to China floating a spy balloon over all of our military installations. We didn't react to China setting up a huge intelligence operation in Cuba. We didn't even react when a Chinese vessel and a Russian nuclear submarine docked in Havana, 90 miles off our border. We didn't really react when China and Russia had a joint practice bombing mission over offshore of Alaska. We didn't react. Well, go back to my story of youth about the bullies. You don't overcome a bully by making concessions to him. You overcome a bully by either punching him or him being convinced that you will punch him if he pushes.
You don't appease.
You just can't let them get away with it because it'll be worse and worse.
Just broad brush, what type of response would have been effective and appropriate? What should we have done?
Well, for one thing, we could have floated a spy balloon over China. Be very simple. Very easy. We could have docked a nuclear submarine in Taiwan. It's even closer to China than Cuba is to us. There's no lack of things that you could do for responses, but almost anything that you would do, as long as it was more powerful in its message, or at least as powerful as what they did, reacting not at all and just dismissing it as not important doesn't work.
Even if the impact is the perception of what they did too, that they can do this.
Perception
and
becomes reality.
Yeah.
You in the media know that better than anybody.
Point taken. With respect to that type of response, is there concern, or was there concern that that would only escalate, that we could find ourselves in an incident that we didn't really intend to wander into?
But I'll put the question the other way. Does anyone think there hasn't been escalation in the face of our present policy? There obviously has been. So the one thing we know for sure is the present policy does not reduce the danger. It actually increases the danger. There's at least a chance a tougher policy might reduce it.
All right. This dovetails into a question from our audience. What are some of your critiques of President Biden's economic policies? Are there any that you support or agree with?
Oh, yeah. Well, I certainly agree with the trade policy. I also agree with part of the CHIPS Act. I was the one who initiated the idea of subsidizing the semiconductor companies because we were importing 3/4 of the semiconductors that we consume. We're the world's largest consumer of semiconductors, which you need for everything. Peacetime use, wartime use, everything. So I'm glad that they finally did get it passed through the Congress. What I don't agree with is they took the same $50 billion that I was requesting and they added to it $450 billion of extraneous items, mostly social welfare things, still called it the CHIPS Act. And I felt strongly enough about it from a national security point of view that I wrote every Republican member of the Congress saying, I know you don't like that they loaded it up with these other things. I don't like it either, but I think the national security imperative is far more significant than that they're putting money in these other activities. So in some areas, I partially agree and partially disagree with him. I totally disagree with the idea of paying people more for not working than they got paid when they were working.
Sure.
It used to be unemployment benefits were set at a certain discount from your prior salary, so it was tied directly.
To assist you, but not allow you to not have to.
Yeah, we should assist them, but the assistance should be a temporary thing to encourage them to go back to work. And that's important because, as I mentioned, I think we need to grow faster to solve a lot of our problems. There are only three components to a country's growth. One is at what rate of increase in the population of working age. Well, there's not much you can do about that short term. It's taken care of by fertility rates, but our fertility rate is not enough to keep growing. Anyhow, so that's one component. Second component is the percentage of the working age population that participates in the workforce. We only have about 62% of the able-bodied working age people either having a job or looking for one. 30-some odd percent neither have a job nor want one.
How does that compare to other countries?
Pardon me?
How does that compare to other countries, that figure?
Oh, we're
Ish.
not in such great shape compared to a lot of countries. Okay. But the more important thing is that's a third, more than a third of your potential workforce not only not contributing, but draining money from society. We were having it was starting to go up under Trump. It's gone a little bit back down now, I think because of these perverse incentives not to work. So that's the second component. And then the third one is productivity. And productivity, I'm a big believer in artificial intelligence, and I think it will be transformative. And like most technological things, well, people are scared that it will cost jobs. The history of technology is it actually creates jobs. It defines them a little differently, but it basically creates jobs. So those are the three things that government economic policy has to deal with.
And would you give us A, B, C, or D in that regard? How would you grade us in that regard, where the United States is in those three areas that you outlined?
Well, I'll say I think that the trade policy is important because every dollar we import is a dollar that isn't produced here. Mm-hmm. Every dollar we export is a dollar that isn't produced somewhere else. So it's related to the two.
Let's talk quickly about we talked about the semiconductor industry, artificial intelligence you just touched on. Other basic things like aluminum and steel, and we don't manufacture. I know there's a lot of talk, certainly in this election, about creating more manufacturing jobs in this country. We've lost so many manufacturing jobs. That's important, obviously, in terms of what it does for our GNP, but why is it also important in terms of our security that we produce this stuff?
It's important because if you look back on World War II, what really won World War II was our industrial might. Germany and Japan combined were not even half the size of our economy. And therefore, we were able ultimately to overwhelm them. Now, it's not so clear because China alone is about 2/3 the size of our economy. Russia is not so big. Russia's economy is barely the size of the state of California. And nobody thinks California is a world power. You need industry, but you also need it to propel the growth in every part of the economy. we are basically a service economy now. We used to be mainly a manufacturing economy. You can't make growth very rapid if all we're doing is flipping hamburgers and watching movies or streaming things on the television set. It doesn't create anything.
We have to make things.
But you need to make things.
Yeah. Let's turn quickly to something else that fascinates me, and I know you've, and it also speaks to how important this area of our growth is, and that is space. That the Commerce Department, under this former secretary, had a lot of involvement in regulating and monitoring what was happening in space. I know you dealt with, what do they call it, space junk, basically.
Yes. Well, yeah, I actually wrote an editorial in the New York Times back when we were in office about space. I think space is tremendously important both to economy and to defense. Let's focus on the economy for the moment. We had been the leader in space launches from the very early stages until about 2010. In about 2010, President Obama decreed that we no longer will be in the space launch business, period. Instead, surprisingly to me, he hired Russia to launch our astronauts to our space station. Then we ended up paying Russia $85 million per seat to haul our astronaut to our space center. Fortunately, that attracted the attention of Elon Musk and a couple of other big high rollers, and so they started commercializing space. And once the commercial instincts came in, space became affordable. Problem with space had been very expensive to break the power of gravity and launch a big thing out. Once you've got it fairly far removed from Earth, it doesn't take much power at all, but breaking gravity is tough. So Musk came up with the idea 70% of the cost of a launch is the lower segment, the part where the rocket fuels and all that were in the beginning. And it was normally just let to crash and be wasted.
Yeah.
He developed a system, and Hillary and I were at the first launch where it actually worked at Kennedy Space Center. He developed a system where the launch mechanism landed on its own feet inside of a little 100-meter circle. Very precise landing. It wasn't just it went wherever the hell it felt like. So he's reusing it 8 times, 10 times. I think his record is 12 times. Well, if you take 70% of the cost of something, then now you can amortize it over 10 or 12 shots. Boy, you are lowering the cost tremendously. And why is space so important? For one thing, you're going to have space mining. The asteroids largely have very precious metals on their surface, so it'd be easy to get them out. They have a lot of platinum, a lot of gold, a lot of all kinds of materials. So there's a potential for that. The other thing that's fascinating is that materials take on different properties when they're in a zero or close to zero gravity environment. Pharmaceuticals perform differently, all sorts of things. 3D printing performs.
So we would manufacture more in space.
Actually manufacturing. And what could make it possible is doing it on the moon. The moon has, as its southern part and as its rear, the part that's always dark, huge amounts of ice. Well, what is ice? Ice is H2O, it's water. what do you need for human existence? You need oxygen and water. And what do you need to go to further out in space? Same too for
fuel.
fuels. So the title of my editorial in the Times was, "It won't be long before the man in the moon is operating a gas station."
Well, it's fascinating. It's a huge industry and getting bigger, the space industry.
Yes, it is.
Is it $1 trillion industry or not yet?
Well, government is a big component, but the telecom part of it has become enormous, and we have the dominant position in that. But there are scary parts too. China is operating on the dark side of the moon. We don't know what they're doing. We've never been on the dark side of the moon, so God only knows what it is.
Do we have any idea what they're doing?
Well, I don't think there are any unclassified ideas, but my point is they recognize it as being important militarily. And one time during Trump, just to show that they had the capability, they destroyed one of their own space satellites deliberately.
Oh.
And that created a lot of junk. And space junk is going to be a problem that we'll have to deal with, because space satellites are designed to last maybe 15 or 20 years, but they gradually implode over time. And so you have little bits of stuff. Well, even a little tiny particle going at 14,000 miles an hour, which is what these are doing, if it hits the solar panel that propels the satellite and provides it with all its activity, it can do a lot of damage.
There's a surprising amount of space junk floating around.
Oh yeah, and there'll be more and more and more and more.
Before we run out of time, Mr. Secretary, let me do sort of a rapid fire from the audience, some of these questions, because we have some really good questions. In a modern leadership context, what are the most important traits to emphasize or exclude? Just a few seconds on that.
Well, at the end of the day, everything should end in a negotiation, and that's the essence of moderate activity, is to have it when nobody gets 100% of what he's looking for, but everybody compromises in the middle.
Okay. Is working remotely viable? Virtual meetings good enough? What do you think of what happened after the pandemic?
Yeah, I was very skeptical of it, but I love Zoom. It saves innumerable plane flights and things like that. So I'm a very big fan of Zoom. I think it depends on the nature of the work product. There are a lot of things you can do at home. I wrote the book at home.
Sure.
There was no need to be in an office to write a book. But I think there are some things, particularly how do you impart corporate culture to young people? How do you bring them along in their skill sets? I think you need a certain degree of real human interaction to do that.
So you need to be in the office.
Yeah, whether it needs to be 5 days a week, I don't know about that. But
what do you think of the Fed's rate cut today, 0.5%? Is that enough? The Fed's rate cut.
Oh, well,
good enough?
He just announced that it will be 0.5 point.
Right.
I've been of the view it didn't make much difference whether it was 1/4 or 1/2. Directionally, I think it is right to start reducing it. I just hope he doesn't do it too fast, because some of the economic data are conflicting as to have we really cured inflation. And I think it is better to err in favor of really curing inflation than it is to worry, do we go into a mild recession?
Right. On that point, are you concerned about, there was a lot of talk about we're hoping for a soft landing, but we may not be able to achieve that. Are you concerned, look 2, 3, 4, 5 years out from a standpoint of a recession? Are we okay?
Well, I don't see the potential for a Great Depression.
Okay.
So I think we're going to have more so-called soft landings. Nobody's ever told me exactly what the boundary line is between a soft landing and a less soft. So I think it's a term of art rather than a term of science.
All right. Very quickly, these are two great questions I want to get in. Compare leadership in the private sector to public service, and any advice you'd give people in that regard. Leadership in private sector versus public service, differences, and what advice you give.
I found in government, there are a lot of middle-level people who are very capable, very experienced, and love this country and love the work that they're doing. But they're trapped in a basically dysfunctional system, and it's not peculiar to our country. The other countries have the same problem with bureaucracy. And here's what happens in a bureaucracy. The incentive system in private sector works. If you do something innovative and it's a success, then you get into a very sharp pyramid of compensation. Public sector, nobody really makes any money. Its pay structure is a very flat oblong. So there's no economic reward for being aggressive and taking a chance. But what there is a congressional investigating committee ready to tear you apart on TV. There's an inspector general fully prepared to blow your career up if your idea didn't work. So it produces a timidity on the part of the people, and they don't come forward with ideas, and they're very resistant to change. I would often find that it took a very long time to get a decision made on a particular topic, and I would say to them, well, why? Why do we have to have this elaborate procedure? And they would say, well, it's the regulation. I say, well, I'm not so sure. Let me see the regulation. Half the time, there was no regulation. It's just that's the way they'd always been doing it, and it's safe to do repetition because nobody can criticize you for it. The other thing that is peculiar about government service, since there's no money, titles are the important thing. But I learned something about titles. Their power varies inversely and exponentially to their length. Think about it. President, very short title, very powerful. Third assistant to the fourth deputy to the undersecretary of state. Big, long title, not much power. But it's the lifeblood of the person who holds that big, long title, because that's what determines is he or she invited to the cocktail party, and if they are, to a dinner, where do they sit? So heaven help you if you get their title wrong.
Very personal. Last thing I want to say about, or ask you about, this book is an American's journey, but it's about America. And there's a sense of optimism here. You remain, despite our challenges, very optimistic about our future?
Yeah, I'm optimistic, provided we can deal with our educational system. When I was a kid, there were two tracks that people were on. One was you would go to college, the other is you would go to some other occupation. And so they modulated the courses depending which one you seemed headed for. We've pretty much done away with vocational training, and it's a disservice to the population, to the young people. We, in fact, have least vocational training of any OECD country. So that's one problem. And in reality, 2/3 of adult Americans don't have a college degree. So the theory that somehow 100% of everybody should go to college it's not even workable, and I don't think it's even desirable. But at the higher technology end, what I'm very troubled with is many schools are no longer teaching high school math, high school physics, high school chemistry. And that's a real problem. We're in an increasingly technological society, and the one way that technology would cause big unemployment will be if the people aren't capable of doing it. And it starts even at lower levels. If you take global surveys of educational outcomes, we rank barely 30th in reading, writing, and arithmetic in the grammar school level. How can you stay the #1 power in the world if you rank 30th in your educational system? It's not going to work.
Yeah.
So we really need to get back to many of the principles that we had in education in earlier periods. And I frankly think not fixing the educational system is a far bigger danger than just China or Russia or Iran, because that's a self-inflicted wound. And self-inflicted wounds are very hard to heal.
Yeah, well said. Our thanks to Wilbur Ross, former U.S. Secretary of Commerce and author of Risks and Returns, Creating Success in Business and in Life. Really good read, I will tell you that. And to Toby Philanthropies for sponsoring this event and others. We encourage all of you to pick up a copy of Risks and Returns here or at your local bookstore. And if you'd like to support the club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, I strongly encourage you to visit our website, www.commonwealthclub.org. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please, Wilbur Ross, former U.S. Commerce Secretary, a big hand. I'm Dan Ashley. Thank you for your kind attention today, and we'll see you next time.